The sitting is resumed. Microphone. Mic.
Order number 1 in the name of the Honourable Leader of the Senate, but assigned to the Honourable Monroe Knight to move the second reading of the Debt, Natural Disaster and Pandemic Deferment of Payment Miscellaneous Provisions Bill 2023.
Senator Dr. Monroe Knight.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, before I begin, I want to recognize the news that came out late yesterday evening that indicates that Barbados has moved up on the Transparency Index. We've moved up by 4 points, ranking 24 out of 180 countries, and we have the highest ranking in the region. Well, Mr. President, this does not mean that everything is perfect. It does mean that the government is doing something good. We should recognize, that a lot of the work that is being done in this honorable chamber, including things like the passage of the Procurement Act, Mr. President, the efficiencies that we are also creating are ensuring that people have a perception that the government is attempting to deal squarely with the issues of governance. And this ranking helps us, all of us, I believe, governments and Barbadians, to recognize that that work is having some fruit. Mr. President, the substantive matter that we will be discussing this afternoon relates to the provision for the deferment of payment of amortizations and interest on debt on the occurrence of a natural disaster or pandemic under particular enactments. Mr. President, this miscellaneous bill will substantially have impact on or make 4 consequential amendments and the schedules, including the schedules thereof. Mr. President, unfortunately, we do not have a single consolidated debt legislation, and therefore it is necessary to amend the various pieces of legislation that make up that framework to ensure that we are able to incorporate the natural disaster and pandemic clauses. Those acts, Mr. President, refer to the External Loans Act, CAP 94D, the Local Loans Act, CAP 98, the Special Loans Act, CAP 105, and the Guarantee of Loans Companies Act, CAP 96. So again, Mr. President, this bill will then have impact, simultaneous impact on these other acts as well. Mr. President, I think that we would do well to have this discussion, certainly at this time, as we are coming just to the end of January 2024 and looking towards the 2024 hurricane season. And Mr. President, I think that we will all note that we've been having some serious rainfall. It has impacted my gym schedule, Mr. President. Every morning, 4:30, 5:30, rain is falling. Difficult, therefore, Mr. President, to do my normal walking at 4:30, 5:30 in the morning. But this is the uncertainty, Mr. President, that we live in as a small island developing state. We all know that with the onset of the impact of climate change, that we now have increasing unpredictability. We now have as well, Mr. President, the scale of impact as Mr. President is also growing. So that we are at a time in which unpredictability of natural disasters, unpredictability of different occurrences are now part of our daily lives that we have to contend with. And therefore, a government has to be able to contend with the question of how do we plan? How do we address these issues in an environment that is so unpredictable? And it means, therefore, that we have to include within our development planning, our socioeconomic planning, that ethos of making sure that we can forward plan and use as many tools as we can in our arsenal in order to be able then to address this unpredictable environment. Mr. President, in 2004, Hurricane Ivan impacted Grenada as a Category 3 hurricane, Mr. President. That damage to Grenada equated to $1.1 billion in damage and 200% of its GDP. In today's world, that would be 1.7 billion. Mr. President, it displaced 18,000 households, damaged 30% of its housing stock, and only 2 of the 75 schools on the island remained intact after the passage of that hurricane. That happened, Mr. President, in September of 2004. And while there was humanitarian aid flowing into Grenada at that time, and development partners were on the ground doing assessments, it was in mid-October that they were convening board meetings to decide what was the level of loan, not grant, loan they would give to help Grenada. So a country in complete devastation, but having to wait until development partners decided how they will treat to almost a month after that big impact. Mr. President, in 2017, Dominica experienced the impact of Hurricane Maria, a Category 5 hurricane, Mr. President. And that damaged 95% of Dominica's housing stock and had a 226% impact on its GDP, 226%, with a reported 3,059 fatalities, Mr. President. In 2019, Hurricane Dorian hit Bahamas for 2 days, Mr. President. Left 74 dead, Mr. President. And the Inter-American Development Bank said that Dorian caused about $3.4 billion in damages, which was equal to 1/4 of Bahamas' GDP. Mr. President, we also as well experienced Hurricane Maria in 2017. It passed us as a tropical storm. It drenched the island to the extent, Mr. President, that we were given a payment from the insurance facility that we'll speak to a little bit more later of just $1.2 million, again, because of the extent of the damage. And so again, Mr. President, the question that we have to ask ourselves, the question that government has to ask itself, is how do we plan? How do we make sure that we have the resources at our hand, at the ready, in order to address the critical concerns of our citizens? How do we ensure that we don't have to wait a month after till somebody is meeting within a boardroom to decide how much money they will lend us on their terms? Because of course, when you are in a crisis, then you are forced then to accept terms that might not be so favorable because of the context that you are in. So, Mr. President, what does a country do? What does a government do? The Inter-American Development Bank, in a paper of this year, January 2024, indicated that a hurricane event in the Caribbean, in the region, has the impact of a 10% increase in public debt. Often, Mr. President, new debt, because again, countries are in the position that they have existing debt, but because of the damage, because of what they have to face, then they have to go out then and get new debt in order to address the situation. And that leads, Mr. President, as the Inter-American Development Bank indicates, to a 10% increase in public debt. And then 3 years, Mr. President, after the event, public debt increases further to 18%, Mr. President. So we have a situation in which, for many of us, faced with the onslaught of climate change as experienced through natural disasters, that it also as well means debt distress. So a Barbados Labour Party government coming into power with a country already, Mr. President, in severe debt distress. When we became the government, Mr. President, this country was in debt of over $17.5 billion, Mr. President. $17.5 billion, Mr. President, or 176% of our GDP. That is the situation that this government found itself in 2018. We had that to face, but multiple downgrades as well, Mr. President, eroded investor confidence, meaning that there was very little room for the government to be able to navigate and to be able to address the circumstances that was impacting us. So this government that came in 2018 and facing these circumstances had to make some drastic decisions about how it would reposition the trajectory of the country, of this country, that was brought to its knees, Mr. President, by a previous administration that had shown themselves a failure, Mr. President, an administration that lacked vision, Mr. President, an administration without the intestinal fortitude, Mr. President, to govern, an administration that treated this society callously, Mr. President, that did not respond to the sewage that was flowing in the streets, Mr. President, or the garbage that was uncollected for months, Mr. President. That was the situation that this government of 2018 came and found itself. And because of that, the cabinet had to form itself into a war cabinet and to effectively mount a rescue mission, Mr. President, for this country, and take on mission critical. And in so doing, we had to gird our loins, Mr. President, and under the leadership of our Prime Minister, do what the previous administration could not do and demonstrate the vision and the intestinal fortitude for leadership in order to rescue this country. And we did so successfully, Mr. President. And we did so successfully in the face of the criticisms of those who, when they were in power, did not have one idea, but all of a sudden, had all the ideas and would suggest that the action that the government that was taking in order to right-size a country that was destroyed and on its knees would not work. And we have shown, Mr. President, that indeed that right-sizing was successful. So we had that circumstance to face, but we also as well learned, Mr. President, from all of the things that I spoke about before, all of the hurricanes and the natural disasters that happened, like I said, in Grenada, in Bahamas, and in Dominica. And like I said, our own experience as well in 2017 with Maria. And let's not forget that we also as well had Kirk in, I think it was September of 2018 as well. And the damage with Kirk, Mr. President, that we had an estimated rainfall in some parts of Barbados of almost 9.5 inches, to the extent, again, that under the insurance facility, we were able to get a payout of some $5.8 million US. And that just showed the extent of the damage. So that with all of that context, the government then, in October of 2018, passed legislation to include, for those creditors, both locally and internationally, to include natural disaster clauses within the new instruments. And we did so, Mr. President, within the context that I had explained. One, as well, a government needing to ensure that it had sufficient wiggle room and space, Mr. President, and also, as well, one that had learned from what other countries had gone through, what we had gone through, and creating an innovative instrument to provide an option, should it need, in order to be able to have the necessary wiggle room. And Mr. President, we know this even in our individual lives. If something happens, all of us, whether we're paying a mortgage or we're paying rent or something happens, what do? We go to the bank, we go to the person that we have to negotiate with, and we beg for a little blight. They say, give me a little breather. Let me negotiate. You know, I can't pay you right now, but give me a little too much, let me get back on my feet. So that essentially, the natural disaster clauses was governments saying to our creditors, we need a little breather. We need a little bigger room. We need a little space in order then to be able to address the critical needs. And this is important, Mr. President, because again, oftentimes we see these things as highfalutin. We see these things as the government, again, either increasing debt. But it has real impact, Mr. President, on our daily lives. Because what happens when we don't have that space, when we don't have that option, Mr. President, of that wiggle room? When a natural disaster strikes, again, the question, will we find ourselves at the hands of having to wait on multilateral development banks to come in and assess? Well, our schools are broken, Mr. President. Well, our main hospital, Mr. President, could potentially be underwater, Mr. President. Do we want a government that has to go out begging, that has to go out waiting, or do we want a government? Do we want a government, Mr. President, that has a plan in place and that is able to address those immediate concerns? And this, Mr. President, this is exactly what we are intended to do with these natural disaster and then also as well pandemic clauses. What the clause does, Mr. President, is that they give us the option, and I want to say option, Mr. President, very clearly, because again, when you look at the consequential amendments, it is an option. Government may take up that option if it so needs to. There's nothing here that says that in every instance that the government will put these in place. It provides an option. As a homeowner, when a storm is coming, when a hurricane is coming, I do multiple things in order to ensure my safety. I don't do one. I bar the windows and make sure I got hurricane straps, or go out and I buy some food. You do multiple things in order to ensure your safety and that of your household. So this is an option in the arsenal